It was a bright morning at the airport, the kind of day when everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Travelers rushed through security lines, rolling their suitcases behind them, phones pressed to their ears. Among them was a tall, calm man in a gray suit. He walked with quiet confidence, holding a single carry-on bag and a boarding pass in his hand. His name was David. David had flown many times before, but today's flight was important. He was heading to an international business meeting that could shape the future of his company. He arrived early, dressed neatly, his shoes polished and his posture straight. He stopped for a coffee, smiled politely at the barista, and walked toward gate 32 where his flight was about to start boarding. The gate area was crowded. People were tired, some impatient, others just trying to find a seat. David waited calmly until the agent called for his boarding group. When it was his turn, he walked up and handed his ticket to the woman behind the counter. She scanned it once. The machine beeped red. The agent frowned and tried again. Another red beep. That's strange, she said under her breath. She looked at David. Sir, this ticket isn't showing as valid. Did you purchase it from a third-party site? David shook his head politely. No, I bought it directly from the airline's website last week. The agent's tone changed slightly. Well, it's not in our system. Maybe it's a fake. The word hung in the air like smoke. People nearby turned their heads. A few passengers began whispering, curious about what was going on. David felt a wave of embarrassment, but he stayed calm. I assure you, he said softly, it's not fake. You can check again. The agent sighed as if he were wasting her time. Sir, please step aside. We have other passengers to board. Her voice was firm, dismissive. David stepped back, standing near the wall, watching as other travelers passed through. He could feel the weight of eyes on him. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with pity. The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable it became. He took a deep breath and waited. Minutes passed. He checked his phone, opened his email, and showed the agent the receipt with the airline's confirmation code. She barely glanced at it. Sir, this could be a doctored email, she said coldly. We've seen this kind of thing before. David looked at her, stunned by her tone. He wanted to ask, why are you treating me like this? But he said nothing. Years of experience had taught him that reacting in anger never helps. He stayed silent. Another passenger, a man in a business suit, walked up behind him. When his ticket was scanned, it beeped green immediately. The agent smiled warmly at him and said, Welcome aboard. David noticed the difference in how she spoke, how her face softened for others but stayed hard when looking at him. He turned away, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He wasn't just being questioned, he was being dismissed, judged, misunderstood. The gate door closed and boarding slowed down. The agent called over a supervisor, a middle-aged man with a serious face. The supervisor glanced at the screen and then at David. What's the issue? This passenger's ticket isn't valid, she said quickly. Could be fake. The supervisor frowned and asked David a few questions. David explained again that he bought the ticket online directly from the airline's official website. The supervisor took his ID, looked at it, then typed something into the computer. I don't see his name on the manifest, the supervisor said. Looks like the system doesn't recognize the booking reference either. David's voice remained calm. That's impossible. I confirmed it this morning. I have the email and the app notification. The supervisor shook his head slowly. Sorry, sir. You'll need to contact customer support. We can't let you board until it's verified. By now, most passengers had boarded. The waiting area was almost empty. David stood there, feeling like the floor had fallen out beneath him. His flight was leaving in less than 15 minutes. He checked his phone again, scrolling through his emails, reading every line of the confirmation. Everything matched. Everything was real. Yet here he was, being treated as if he was trying to cheat the system. The agent looked at him again. Sir, you can step aside, please. You're blocking the next group. He stepped further away near a window overlooking the runway. Outside, planes moved slowly across the tarmac, taking off into the wide blue sky. He'd worked so hard to reach a point where he could fly anywhere in the world, and yet in this moment it felt like he didn't belong anywhere. He closed his eyes for a second, forcing himself to stay calm. Losing his temper would only make things worse. But deep down something shifted. This wasn't just about a ticket anymore. It was about dignity. A security guard walked up, quiet but alert. Is there a problem here? He asked the agent. She pointed at David. This passenger presented a fake ticket. We're just sorting it out. The word fake again, this time from someone else's mouth. It stung even more. The guard nodded but didn't say anything rude. Still, the message was clear. David was under suspicion. He pulled out his phone again and scrolled to his contacts. There was one name he hadn't planned to call that day, his business partner who handled most of their investments. David hesitated for a moment, then pressed the call button. When the man answered, David spoke calmly. "We need to finalize the airline negotiation today. Can you make it happen within the hour?" His partner sounded surprised. "Today? That's sudden. Are you sure?" "Yes," David said quietly. "Close it. The regional route they operate. I want it under our wing before noon." He hung up before the conversation could continue. He didn't raise his voice or look around to see who was watching. He just stood there watching the planes outside, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. Behind him, the gate agents were whispering to each other. One of them looked uneasy, perhaps realizing the situation might not be what they thought. But the supervisor insisted the ticket wasn't in the system. "Nothing we can do," he said firmly. David checked his watch. Only 11 minutes left before the scheduled departure. He didn't move. He didn't plead. He simply waited. Passengers inside the plane were settling into their seats. The pilot made announcements over the speakers. The gate door was about to close when one of the agent's phones rang. She picked it up, her expression changing quickly. She whispered something to the supervisor, who looked confused, then startled. He grabbed the phone, listened for a few seconds, and then turned his gaze toward David. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The supervisor's tone softened. He approached David slowly with an uncertain smile. "Sir, it seems there's been a misunderstanding," he said. "Would you mind waiting just a moment?" David looked at him calmly. "I've been waiting." The supervisor nodded awkwardly and stepped aside to make another call. The agent who had dismissed David now looked nervous, her earlier confidence gone. Something big was clearly happening, but she didn't understand what. David stayed silent, his eyes steady. Inside, he already knew. His call had reached the right ears. His team had acted fast. As the minutes ticked down, the airport buzz around them continued. People hurrying to gates, announcements echoing through the hall, luggage wheels clattering on the floor. But at gate 32, time seemed to slow down. Everyone nearby could sense that something unusual was unfolding. The supervisor returned, his face pale. "Sir," he said quietly, "someone from our senior management would like to speak with you." "Right now." David nodded once. "Of course." He followed the supervisor toward a small office near the gate. The agent who had accused him avoided eye contact as he passed by. He didn't say a word to her. There was no need. Inside the office, the phone was on speaker. A calm voice from the airline's headquarters spoke quickly, explaining that there had been a system glitch, that David's ticket was indeed valid, and that they deeply regretted the inconvenience. David listened without expression. When they were done, he simply said, "Thank you for confirming." He walked back toward the gate. The agent hurried to reopen the door for him, apologizing under her breath. David gave a polite nod but said nothing. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He didn't need to prove his worth with words. The next few hours and days would do that for him. As he took his seat near the window, he looked out at the sky again. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and he smiled faintly. The same people who had questioned his presence would soon realize just who he was and what he represented. And somewhere, far from the airport, his business partner was already signing the papers that would change everything. The plane took off smoothly, climbing through the clouds while sunlight poured through the small oval windows. David leaned back in his seat, his hands folded quietly on his lap. Around him, passengers chatted, read magazines, or dozed off, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the meeting anymore. He was thinking about the airport, about the looks, about the word fake. He had learned to live with assumptions, to rise above people's quick judgments. But that morning had been different. It wasn't just inconvenience. It was humiliation in front of strangers. It was a reminder that even success couldn't shield you from ignorance. Still, he chose not to carry anger with him. Instead, he turned it into quiet determination. The flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. When one stopped beside his row, she smiled politely. "Coffee or tea, sir?" she asked. Her tone was kind, unaware of what he had been through just minutes before. "Coffee, please," he said softly. She handed him a small cup, and he thanked her. He looked out the window as the clouds drifted below, forming a soft, endless blanket. Somewhere beneath that white ocean was the city where he had been embarrassed. And somewhere beyond the horizon, his team was already working on a deal that would make history. When the plane landed a few hours later, David waited until the other passengers had disembarked before standing up. He didn't rush. He never did. His calmness often made people underestimate him, which he quietly appreciated. He walked through the terminal, collected his bag, and stepped into the afternoon light outside the airport. His driver was already waiting. "Welcome, sir," the driver said, opening the car door. "We're heading straight to the office?" David nodded. "Yes, let's not waste time." The city stretched ahead, tall buildings, busy streets, and the constant hum of movement. As they drove, David's phone buzzed. It was his business partner calling with an update. "It's done," the man said. "They signed everything. The acquisition is official," David smiled faintly. "Good work." He hung up and looked out the window again. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same airline whose staff had accused him of using a fake ticket now partly belonged to him. But he didn't want revenge. He wanted change, a culture that valued respect, not assumptions. At his office, the team was already waiting. The lobby was modern, filled with warm light and soft music. His assistant greeted him with a relieved smile. "We heard about what happened," she said quietly. "Are you okay?" David nodded. "I'm fine," he replied. "But it reminded me why we do what we do." He walked into the conference room where his team had gathered around a large table. They stood when he entered. On the screen behind them was a slideshow with the new airline's logo and a message that read, "Welcome to the future of travel." "All right," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We own the regional route now. But this isn't just another investment. It's an opportunity to rebuild trust. I want every passenger, no matter who they are, to feel respected when they fly. No more dismissive tones. No more assumptions. If someone walks in with a valid ticket, they should be treated like any other traveler." The room was silent for a moment, then one of the younger team members spoke up. "Should we address what happened publicly, sir? The story might spread." David thought for a moment. "Not yet," he said. "Let them discover the change naturally. Actions speak louder than headlines." The meeting continued for hours, filled with strategy discussions, rebranding ideas, and plans to improve customer experience. David listened carefully, guiding his team without raising his voice. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a listener, a builder, a man who believed that respect was more powerful than ego. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind for a while, staring at the city skyline through the large glass windows. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the buildings. For most people, today would have been about humiliation and anger. For him, it was about vision. That night, as he returned to his hotel, the same airline's logo flashed on the television screen in the lobby, a cheerful commercial showing smiling passengers boarding with ease. He paused for a moment watching. The contrast between the ad and his morning experience made him sigh softly. "We can do better," he murmured. The next morning, his phone buzzed again. A message from his partner. "Media will find out soon. Prepare for attention." David replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. He didn't need to explain himself. He never sought attention, but when it came, he used it wisely. Within days, the acquisition became public news. Business channels reported, "Prominent entrepreneur acquires regional airline route." None of them mentioned what had happened at the airport. Not yet. But people who worked in the airline began to piece the story together. At the same airport where it had all started, the same gate agent who had questioned David's ticket sat behind her desk again. She was scrolling through her phone during a quiet moment when she saw the headline. Her face turned pale as she read the name. Her hands froze above the keyboard. Her coworker noticed and asked, "You okay?" She nodded weakly. I think I made a mistake." The coworker looked over her shoulder and read the article too. "Wait, that's the same guy you said had a fake ticket?" She didn't respond. She just stared at the photo. David standing next to airline executives, smiling politely, shaking hands. The caption read, "New owner promises to bring humanity back to air travel." For the rest of the day, she couldn't focus. Guilt sat heavy in her chest. The memory of her dismissive tone, the way she'd said the word fake, replayed over and over in her mind. Meanwhile, at his office, David was already thinking ahead. He had no interest in humiliating anyone. Instead, he wanted to turn that moment into a lesson. He scheduled a meeting with the new airline's regional management team. When they gathered, he began by saying, "Before we talk numbers, I want to talk about respect. We haven't heard. Our job is not to judge their story. It's to serve them with dignity." The managers listened intently. Some nodded. Others looked down, reflecting on their own behavior. One spoke up. "You're right. Sometimes we forget that behind every ticket is a human being." David smiled faintly. Exactly. After the meeting, he walked through the hangar where aircraft engineers were working. The smell of jet fuel filled the air. Workers in bright vests waved as he passed. He greeted them warmly, asking about their day. To him, leadership wasn't about standing above others. It was about standing among them. Later, he visited the airline's training center, where new staff were being prepared for customer service roles. He spoke to the trainees, telling them the same story but leaving out that it had happened to him. "Imagine," he said, "someone walks in tired, nervous, or anxious. You never know what they've been through, but how you treat them could make their day or break it." The young trainees nodded, taking notes. One raised her hand. "Sir," she asked, "have you ever been treated unfairly when you were a customer?" David smiled. "We all have," he said. "What matters is how we respond. Some people fight back with anger. Others respond with change. I choose the second way." When he left the training center, a small sense of pride filled him. He wasn't just running a business anymore. He was changing a culture. That evening, he received another call from his partner. "The airline's PR team wants to know if you'll do a public interview," the man said. "They think it'll help the brand." David considered it for a moment. "Maybe later," he said. "For now, let's focus on actions. Let people feel the difference first. Then they'll understand the story without us having to tell it." Over the next few weeks, subtle changes began to appear. Staff training improved. Customer satisfaction rose. The company's tone shifted from formal and distant to warm and respectful. Even the smallest details, how flight attendants greeted passengers, how gate agents handled issues, started to change. And while the world began to notice the airline's new spirit, David remained quietly in the background. He didn't seek cameras or praise. He spent his time flying on the same routes, observing silently, noting what still needed improvement. One day, weeks later, he returned to the same airport where everything had started. He walked to the same gate, Gate 32. The same agent was there. Her eyes widened when she saw him. She stood quickly, her face red with nervousness. "Sir," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, I'm truly sorry for what happened that day." David looked at her kindly. "It's all right," he said. "What matters is what we learn." She nodded, relieved but emotional. "I've changed how I speak to people now," she said. "I remember that moment every time I scan a ticket." David smiled gently. Then it was worth it. He walked away, leaving her speechless, her eyes following him as he disappeared down the terminal. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't shouted. They're felt quietly in the small changes that last forever. As David boarded another flight, he looked out the window again. The plane began to move, engines humming beneath his feet. He smiled softly, knowing that one moment of unfairness had sparked something far greater, a new beginning, built on respect. The following weeks were busy, but they carried a quiet satisfaction. The airline's new direction was slowly taking shape, and the change was noticeable. Passengers were smiling more, staff were speaking kindly, and the entire company seemed to be breathing differently. David spent his days visiting airports, talking to employees, and personally overseeing the transformation. He didn't just want to manage from an office. He wanted to feel the heartbeat of the company. One morning, he arrived at a regional airport where one of the airline's smaller offices operated. It wasn't a grand place and just a few gates and a small staff, but it mattered just as much as the larger hubs. When David stepped inside, the employees greeted him warmly. They already knew who he was, not just as the new owner, but as the man whose story had quietly changed the company's spirit. He told them about the experience, not with anger, but with clarity. "This is not about blame," he said. "It's about awareness. Every day we meet people we don't know, and every one of them has a story." A young ground staff member, nervous but eager, approached him. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you," she said. "Before you came, people didn't believe management cared about us. Now it feels different. Like we matter." David smiled softly. "You do matter. Every one of you. Never forget that." He walked through the terminal, watching as an elderly passenger struggled with her luggage. Without hesitation, one of the staff members rushed forward to help. It was such a simple gesture, but it filled David with pride. That was exactly the kind of change he wanted to see. Not forced, but natural, coming from the heart. Later that day, he met with the airport's local manager in a small office overlooking the runway. They discussed improvements, staff morale, and customer feedback. The manager mentioned that passengers were starting to write positive reviews online. "They're noticing the difference," the man said with a smile. "One even said it feels like flying with family again." David nodded. "That's what we're aiming for." But behind all the progress, there was still work to do. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some senior staff resisted new policies, thinking they were unnecessary. Others doubted that kindness could really make a difference in business. David knew he would have to prove it not just with words, but with results. Back at headquarters, the board was holding a meeting. Some of the directors looked concerned. One of them said, "David, we understand your vision, but focusing too much on emotional connections might slow us down financially." "We need strong numbers," David listened patiently. When the man finished, he replied, "Numbers are important, yes. But numbers come from people. If our people are inspired, respected, and proud of their work, those numbers will take care of themselves." The room fell quiet. Another board member, older and more thoughtful, nodded slowly. "He's right," she said. "Happy staff mean loyal customers. That's how real growth begins." After the meeting, David stepped out onto the office balcony. The evening wind brushed against his face. Below, the city moved in rhythm, cars honking, lights flickering, people hurrying home. He thought about how one bad moment at an airport had brought him here. Life had a strange way of turning pain into purpose. That weekend, David decided to fly again, this time without telling anyone who he was. He booked an economy seat under a different name and showed up like any other traveler. He wanted to experience the service firsthand, to see if his message had truly reached the front lines. At the check-in counter, a young agent greeted him with a smile. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your ticket and ID?" she asked. He handed them over and she quickly processed his boarding pass. "All set," she said cheerfully. "Have a great flight." No judgment, no hesitation, just kindness. It was a small thing, but to David it meant everything. At the gate, he sat among the other passengers, blending in. The boarding call came and he waited his turn. When he approached the gate agent, the man scanned his ticket and smiled. "Enjoy your trip, sir," David nodded. "Thank you." The flight went smoothly. The attendants were polite, the atmosphere calm. He watched how they interacted with passengers, helping an old man find space for his bag, offering water to a mother with a baby, smiling even when passengers were impatient. The warmth felt genuine. After landing, David quietly sent a message to his team. "Keep it up. The heart of this company is beating stronger than ever." Days later, something unexpected happened. A journalist reached out to David's office. The reporter had heard whispers about the mysterious ticket incident and the quiet airline acquisition that followed. They wanted to write a story, not a scandal, but an inspiring piece about leadership, humility, and change. At first, David hesitated. He had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But after discussing it with his partner, he agreed to a short interview as long as it focused on lessons, not drama. The interview took place in his office, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The reporter, curious but respectful, asked, "Is it true that an incident at an airport inspired you to buy part of this airline?" David smiled faintly. "Let's just say it reminded me that respect is the most valuable ticket anyone can have. We can't always control how others treat us, but we can control how we respond. And I wanted my response to create something better." The journalist nodded thoughtfully. "That's a powerful message. Do you hope this story changes how companies handle customer service?" David leaned back slightly. "I hope it changes how people handle people. Whether you're serving coffee, flying a plane, or running a company, It all comes down to empathy. When the article was published, it spread quickly. The headline read, "From Insult to Inspiration: How One CEO Turned Disrespect into a Revolution in the Skies." The story touched millions of readers. People shared it on social media, praising the humility and strength behind it. The airline saw a surge of positive attention. Employees felt proud, passengers felt hopeful, and the company's reputation soared. But David didn't let the attention distract him. He continued traveling quietly, meeting staff at small airports, listening to their stories. One day he visited a training center where new employees were going through onboarding. When he walked in, they were watching a video, a short clip from the news article about him. He stood at the back of the room, unnoticed at first, listening as the instructor spoke. "This is why we do what we do," the instructor said. "Every person who walks into our airport deserves respect, no matter how they look, talk, or dress. One kind gesture can change everything." The trainees nodded, inspired. Then one of them noticed David standing quietly near the door. "Sir," she said, suddenly standing up. The room fell silent. David smiled. "Please sit. I was just listening." The instructor looked both nervous and honored. "We were just talking about you, sir." "I could tell," he said with a warm laugh. "I'm glad to see the message spreading. Keep it alive. Not because it's my story, but because it should be everyone's story." He stayed for a while, answering their questions, encouraging them to approach their jobs with heart. When he left, they applauded softly, not because he was their boss, but because he was someone who reminded them what kindness looked like in action. Later that evening, David sat alone in a small cafe near the airport. He sipped his coffee slowly, thinking about how far things had come. He remembered the red beep of that ticket scanner, the agent's cold words, and the heat of embarrassment that had rushed through him. Now those moments felt distant, like a storm that had passed and left behind clear skies. His phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the airline's senior executives. "We just received a letter from a passenger who said our staff helped her after she fainted at check-in. She said it was the kindest experience she's ever had with any airline." David smiled and typed back, "That's what success looks like." The next morning he took an early flight again, this time to a city where the airline was planning to launch a new route. As he boarded, he noticed something small but meaningful, a framed poster near the gate that read, "Every ticket tells a story. Treat each one with respect." He stopped for a moment, taking it in. The slogan wasn't his idea. It came from the staff themselves. That was what made it beautiful. As he settled into his seat, he looked around at the passengers, people of all colors, backgrounds, and dreams. They didn't know who he was, and he liked it that way. He wanted to see the world as it was, not from behind a title. When the plane began to move, he gazed out the window and smiled softly. Sometimes life's most painful moments carry the seeds of something extraordinary. You just have to have the patience and the heart to let them grow. The engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, carrying not just passengers, but a story that had already changed countless lives. And as the clouds opened up beneath him, David whispered to himself, "Respect. That's the true flight that never ends." The atmosphere in the airport had shifted since that morning. Whispers spread quickly among the crew, and people who had been watching the scene earlier still remembered the quiet man who had walked away after being told his ticket was fake. No one had expected that in less than half an hour, everything would turn upside down. When David returned to the gate, his face was calm, his steps steady. He wasn't angry, though everyone who saw him that day thought he had every right to be. The gate agent stood frozen as they watched a regional manager approach him with a look of nervous respect. The man was holding his phone, constantly glancing at the screen as if confirming details with someone far more important. "Sir," the manager said quietly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. May I speak with you privately?" David simply nodded and followed him a few steps away from the counter. The crew stood still, trying to piece together what was happening. None of them could guess that this soft-spoken passenger had just completed a deal that changed the very ownership of their route. The manager cleared his throat nervously. "I've just been informed that your company has, acquired operational rights to this regional route." I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received earlier. It should never have happened." David didn't gloat or smile. He just looked the man in the eye and said, "I understand mistakes happen, but sometimes mistakes teach us more than rules ever could." The manager exhaled, relieved by the kindness in his tone. "We've also confirmed your ticket is perfectly valid, sir." "You're welcome to board any time." David shook his head slightly. "It's not about the seat anymore," he replied softly. "It's about what this moment means. I don't need special treatment. I just want fairness for everyone who walks through that gate." The manager nodded respectfully and gestured for the gate agents to approach. They came forward hesitantly, faces flushed with embarrassment. One of them whispered, "We're really sorry, sir. We thought—" He interrupted gently. "You thought I didn't belong here. That's the problem. You didn't check twice. You assumed." He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried more weight than shouting ever could. The passengers nearby were silent now. Some of them had watched the earlier scene unfold. They saw the same man who had been dismissed now standing calmly as the very people who mocked him apologized. It was a sight that stirred something deep inside them. David turned back toward the gate and said, "Please continue your work. Treat the next person like you would want to be treated. That's all I ask." He picked up his small suitcase and started to walk away. But before he could, the manager stopped him again. "Sir, the company chairman would like to speak with you directly." David sighed softly and took the call. On the other end, a voice filled with urgency greeted him. "Mr. David, I just want to say how deeply sorry we are. This should never have happened. Our entire staff is being reminded of our code of conduct immediately." He listened quietly, then replied, "I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in change. People deserve to feel respected when they travel. I'll expect to see that reflected in your training and policies." The chairman agreed instantly, promising a full review. When the call ended, David looked at the anxious faces around him and said, "It's okay. Let's move forward." A few minutes later, he sat down in the lounge, finally alone. The window beside him looked out over the runway, where planes came and went like giant birds in motion. For a moment, he closed his eyes, breathing deeply, allowing the calm to settle in. In those quiet minutes, his mind drifted to his younger days. He remembered being a boy standing at the edge of a small airstrip near his hometown, watching planes take off. Back then, flying felt like a dream for people who lived far away from his world. He promised himself that someday, he would not just fly, he would own something that flew. And now, years later, he had just acquired control over a flight route that symbolized exactly that dream. But he didn't feel triumphant. He felt responsible. He knew this moment meant more than revenge or pride. It was about creating something better than what he had faced. Hours later, he finally boarded another flight arranged privately by his company. As he settled into his seat, one of his assistants sent him updates confirming that the news had started to spread across business circles. The acquisition had raised eyebrows. Reporters were already calling his office, asking if it was true that he'd bought the same route he'd been denied earlier that day. He smiled faintly at the irony. "Don't respond to any of them," he told his assistant. "This isn't about headlines. It's about values." The assistant agreed and ended the call. David leaned back, gazing out at the clouds as the plane took off. He thought about how small moments can reveal big truths. A simple act of unfairness had exposed a culture that still needed to change, and maybe, through this, he could be part of that change. The next morning, as he walked into his office, his team was already gathered, discussing how to handle the sudden media attention. His legal advisor looked nervous. "This story's going to spread fast," she said. "People love dramatic turnarounds." David placed his briefcase on the table and replied, "Then let's make sure they also see the purpose behind it. We'll announce a new initiative focused on hospitality training and respectful service in aviation." "If this happened to me, it's happening to others too," one of his team members asked. "Should we release a public statement?" He shook his head. "Not yet. Let the story speak for itself first." Over the next few days, news of what had happened reached social media. People started sharing versions of the story, some true, some exaggerated. They admired the calmness he had shown, and many called it a lesson in dignity. The airline, now partly under his ownership, issued a public apology and announced a new training policy emphasizing empathy and fairness. But what caught David's attention wasn't the headlines, it was the hundreds of Messages from ordinary travelers sharing their own stories. Some had been treated unfairly for how they looked, dressed, or spoke. Others had missed flights because staff didn't believe their words. Their pain reminded him why he started his journey in the first place. One evening, while reading those messages, he felt a quiet resolve building inside him. He called his operations director and said, "We're going to start something new. I want a program that trains airline employees not just to serve, but to understand. We'll call it Project Horizon." The director asked, "What's the goal?" David replied, "To make sure no passenger ever feels small for being themselves. I want kindness to be standard, not rare." The idea took off quickly. Within weeks, training sessions began across multiple airports. David visited one personally, standing quietly at the back as new recruits practiced scenarios. When a young employee hesitated during a role play, he stepped forward and said gently, "It's not about following a rule book. It's about seeing the person in front of you. If you remember that, you'll always do right." The young trainee smiled nervously and nodded. The whole room felt inspired by his presence. Not because he was the boss, but because he spoke from real experience. By the end of that month, the company had begun to shift. Complaints dropped. Staff morale improved. Travelers noticed the difference. And though the story of the denied ticket kept circulating online, David never corrected or embellished it. He simply let it serve as a quiet reminder of how life can turn when one chooses patience over anger. As he stood one evening at another airport, watching planes glow under the runway lights, he thought back to that first humiliating moment at the gate. What had felt like an insult had become a turning point. He realized that true strength wasn't about showing power, it was about showing character. He smiled faintly, adjusting his jacket, ready for another flight. The same crew who once doubted him now greeted him warmly, unaware that he had been the man they once embarrassed. He didn't need them to remember. What mattered most was that they had changed, and so had he. Months passed, and life moved quickly for David. The story that had once been whispered across airport lounges had now become something bigger, a lesson shared in boardrooms, leadership seminars, and even schools. People spoke about how one man had turned humiliation into a symbol of dignity and purpose. But to David, it was never about fame. It was about doing the right thing when the wrong thing would have been easier. One morning, David woke early in his apartment overlooking the city skyline. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden light over the tall buildings. He poured himself a cup of coffee and looked at his calendar. A flight inspection was scheduled that day. He smiled to himself, realizing it was the same route he had once been denied boarding on months ago. He didn't mention it to anyone in the office. He wanted to experience it naturally as any traveler would. He dressed simply, wearing a dark suit and carrying the same small suitcase he had that morning of the incident. As he drove to the airport, he thought about how far things had come. Project Horizon had become one of the company's most successful initiatives. Employees from different backgrounds now worked together with a sense of shared respect. The tone of service across the airline had shifted completely. When David reached the terminal, he noticed small changes that made a big difference. Smiling attendants, clear communication, passengers being guided kindly instead of ordered around. He could tell the new training was working. The air even felt lighter, friendlier. At the check-in desk, a young attendant greeted him with a genuine smile. "Good morning, sir. May I see your ticket, please?" she asked politely. He handed it over. Her eyes scanned the screen, then she looked back at him and said, "Everything looks perfect. Thank you for choosing us." Her tone carried warmth, no trace of judgment or hesitation. David nodded slightly. "You're doing a great job." She seemed surprised but grateful. "Thank you, sir. We try to make sure everyone feels welcome." Those words touched him more than he expected. He walked toward the boarding area, taking in every detail, the friendly conversations between passengers, the relaxed smiles of the staff, and the calm efficiency at the gate. This was the same place where he had once been told his ticket was fake, but now it felt like a different world. As he waited, a middle-aged man sitting nearby struck up a conversation. "You travel often?" he asked casually. David smiled. "Sometimes, mostly for work." The man nodded, glancing at the boarding screen. "This airline has really improved lately. Used to be so tense around here. I heard they have new management or something." David chuckled softly. "Yes, something like that.